How can Africa speed up its development? By speeding up its energy transformation. Despite Africa's great potential for clean energy, only a tiny fraction of the world's renewables is installed here. The African continent is growing faster than ever, and it simply can no longer afford more investments in the dirty and fragile economy of the past. Today, we're at a turning point. The recovery plans are the once-in-history push to radically change direction. We are here to make it happen. At Res for Africa, we stand for Africa. We believe in its huge potential. We believe in its innate energy. We believe in its growth. And we believe that all it needs is an enabling environment for its full development. At Res for Africa, we care for Africa. That's why we believe that clean energy is the only way to go. Because renewables mean more affordability. Because renewables mean more jobs. Because renewables mean more value. Because renewables mean more resilience, social justice, and health. At Res for Africa, we join for Africa. A unique blend of expertise along the whole value chain of renewables, joining forces to accelerate the transition towards a sustainable and inclusive future. At Res for Africa, we innovate for Africa. We constantly look for new, improved energy solutions to provide not just clean and powerful electricity, but also cutting-edge and reliable plants, electrical grids that guarantee quality and stability through digitalization and storage. At Res for Africa, we act for Africa. We promote dialogue between governments and private players to define conscious, long-term policies, encouraging adequate investments. We share know-how with all stakeholders to promote the full development of Africa together. We train locals on the field to share our expertise and make them owners of their energy. And we never, ever stop looking for new and win-win business models made of African DNA. With a long-term green recovery strategy, we can finally build back better in Africa, ensuring universal access to energy, making its economy more resilient, and leading the whole continent straight into a sustainable era. We are Res for Africa. Our mission is to build a better future through better energy. In Africa, with Africa, for Africa.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this wonderful webinar on assessing investment risk in the Mediterranean area. I am Roberto Bigotti, not only the Secretary General of the Foundation Res for Africa, but I started in 2012 the Res for Med program, which is a part of our program dedicated to North Africa. At that time, I remind you, the main philosophy was desert tech, importing in Europe the renewable energy produced in Africa. Luckily, after 10 years, we don't have any more this problem because renewable are cheaper and they have a lot of advantages you saw in our video. But we see that the investments are not there on scale, and that's why we once again asked our membership, particularly PwC, to make a survey why things do not happen, how the perception of the investors is there. So first of all, thank you to all the speakers. Thank you to Medareg, who is co-hosting the meeting. Thank you, Hassan. Thank you, of course, Sorina will moderate and Pedro moderate the meeting. But thank you very much also to Yasmina Odzik, which is the manager of capital project of PwC, who will report on her study done with us. Ariane Brunel from EBRD, Stefan Gitonga from UNDP, and Costanza Strinati from IRENA, and of course, Pedro, who is our co-author. I will go quickly to the slides now. Next slide, you will play, if you want. Next slide shows just the foundation today is a growing membership, more and more European and international, and we have investors, manufacturers, banks, consultants, and a lot of partners there. But we work always in contact, next slide, also with the local people there. This is, for instance, the logo of the company, agency, ministries with whom we have already a fixed engagement, but many, many more are there. So to show you that we dialogue with because our platform is a dialogue platform, and we want to be sure we do share with our counterpart in North Africa our thoughts. It is true we are mainly a private-driven and organization, but that's why we think to scale up renewable investment there, you need to have the perception of the investors. Next slide. Well, this is a recap of the latest publication that we have done on under Reds for Africa, Reds for Med actually logo. You see in the center, you see also the one done again on cross-border. But on the left, you see the sequence of the two surveys done 2016, the main barrier affecting investment in Mediterranean, and today the survey 2020, which is the topic of our meeting. I think those is a cross-cutting regional approach that I think will teach a lot, and also we hope to have reaction from the government. Next slide. We also have to reiterate, I think also Hassan, we reiterate the context of the Southern Mediterranean country. There is incredible demand growth, and the numbers are there. There is also the need for a GDP recovery after COVID, and also the numbers are there. Also to encourage the young population to find a job. High dependence on fossil fuel, unfortunately, will be shown later. Political instability, this is unfortunately still there, and the lack of water, because this is becoming a critical factor in energy. In the next slide, you also see the dramatic really showing in the 10 years, 2010, 2018, the IEA made a survey on the kind of resources which are used for power sector in those countries. And you see how little things changed. Maybe Morocco changed some, maybe Egypt, mostly water. So I think we are really very lagging back in the deployment, because in 10 years, not much has happened. And that's why, together with Ilaria and Luca, our colleague, we are doing a study on why only 2% of the world additional renewable capacity was done in the continent Africa. That's really dramatic, because everything, everywhere else, renewable are getting. So I think we are going to support these dramatic outcomes with our survey. Next slide. To us, it's also very important in the continent, in Africa, and also sometimes in some of your countries in the Mediterranean, private sector does not play enough role and should. You see on the left in blue, the percentage of private sector which is allowed to enter in the generation part, which is consistent. I mean, IPP, power purchase agreement, it's possible. Unfortunately, the second figure, the electrical tower, you see a very tiny fraction of private sector is allowed to enter in the market. So this is also something has to be fixed by the regulators. That's why we are here with the MedReg. I think we need to support the monopolistic, very often, mostly bankrupt company who survive only because they have to give free, almost free energy, and they are supported by the government. I think this will not help to make the scaling up of energy and the transition. So we need to allow private sector to enter also in the business of a transmission distribution. Next slide. Well, this is exactly the title of the why we found important to go back from the previous survey done in 2016. 6 years later, we need to assess again the situation, which in a way is improving, but not as it should. And I think Yasmina will delight you with their outcome. And finally, I think we have one or two more slides. Next one. Well, we are committed to addressing this barrier. We don't want to impose, we want to propose our vision because it's based, be careful, not only on European point of view. Our member invest in at least 28 countries, so they can bring you the story of Brazil, Mexico, Canada, Thailand, etc. So it is not a Eurocentric view, it's a worldwide view. The improvements and the conditions for renewable are now worldwide. I mean, last week there was the announcement that solar power, PV, in Arabia, in Saudi Arabia, is 1 cent per kilowatt hour. What are we talking about? You know, oh no, okay, this is a record, but average 4 or 5 cents. No coal, no gas, no other can compete. That's why the regulators and the government of the Mediterranean country should really wake up and make this happen. And of course, those are the topics I want you to show. They have to fill the gap between the measure and the implementation. Sometimes the government announced so much percent. Yeah, but this is just an announcement for Paris Agreement. Then nothing's happened. It's also an unclear and unorganized coordination between government institutions, local authorities, and policymakers. I want to hear from Hassan now his opinion. The grids are either not stable, not flexible to accommodate new capacity. There's a lot of resistance to include in the plan, in the scenario, renewable, and of course, no substantial support because there are very few bankable projects in the region. Of course, there are exceptions. So we are here to promote this to be happening. I think I'm almost done. I think the last slide is my name, and with this, with this preliminary introduction, I give the floor to Hassan Odrok, the Deputy Secretary General MedReg, who can complement the vision from the regulator point of view. And thank you so much for your attention. Hassan.
Thank you very much, Roberto. And I would like to also welcome all the participants and our stakeholders. And then good morning, buongiorno to everyone. Roberto has already indicated a kind of overall view in the developments of the renewable energy in the world, particularly in Africa. As we have been saying since sometimes that renewable energy has started with a kind of romantic story, as it was claimed by someone in last 15 to 20 years. So before going into some details, I would like to just brief you about MedReg, who we are and what we do. MedReg is the associations of energy regulators from the Mediterranean region. So we have 27 members and from 22 countries, basically all the countries in the Mediterranean region. Our main objective is to promote non-discriminatory, compatible, and transparent energy regulations with a view to ensuring a stable, secure, and competitive energy market in the Mediterranean region. So through, with these objectives, we are providing capacity building activities. We are delivering and preparing reports and surveys for our members, and we exchange with knowledge and know-how with our members. So we support our members in their endeavors in creating transparent and competitive energy markets. As I said, as it was said some time ago, that renewable energy is a romantic story. Yes, it was, but now this romantic story has turned into a real love, and this real love has turned into a kind of good marriage. Since 15 years, there had been several good progress. If you look at the share of renewable energy into total energy consumption, particularly into generation of electricity, has dramatically increased almost everywhere. So yes, now we have a happily marriage with some kids and children. So now how we can sustain this marriage with several kids for a sustainable energy developments? So basically, in order to do this one, there are several challenges ahead of us. So first and foremost, we have to cope. We have to somehow face with these challenges. Just recently, I have seen a documentary of David Attenborough, this famous British scientist. And in this very recent documentary, it was saying that the total reserves or the total capacity of renewable energy would be sufficient to really cope with all the demands of the world, even 20-fold higher. So basically, the potential today's of the renewable energy potential in the world is 20 times higher than the total demand of the world. So it's huge and significant. Of course, the problem or the challenges here is to how to really convert this potential into our lives for a sustainable energy developments. First and foremost, I know from my experience in the last 30 years, the investor perspective, particularly, they are looking into two things before investing in anywhere. Whether there is a stable, transparent, let's say the regulatory framework with a kind of independent regulators. This is the first prerequisite. I have met with hundreds of investors in my past while working for the energy community, while working for the European Commission. I met with them, discussed all this. Even from the international financial organizations, they are also looking for this, whether any country has a good regulatory framework with an independent regulators monitoring the market. And second questions, how the tariff, how the prices are determined or approved. And based on these two prerequisites, they were deciding whether to really invest there or not. So in that respect, I would say that MEDREC has been supporting all our members to create a non-discriminatory, transparent, and competitive regulatory frameworks, because we know that if you create this regulatory framework with an independent regulators, we will definitely attract the investors. So here now today, we are going to discuss in details and looking into with a kind of different perspective from our, let's say, the international organizations, international financing organizations. We have very good speakers from EBRD and from UNDP and from IRENA. They are going to share their experience today with us. I would wish a fruitful and very efficient, let's say, the webinar. I hope it will be fruitful for all our attendees. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hassan, for your complementary point of view. I think it makes sense that the regulators and the private sector together converge on the key factors to make things happening. And thank you also again for the encouraging identification of the key factors. We work with you very gladly, because I think if there's one sector who will make things happen, is exactly regulators. Now, I'm glad to pass the floor to Sorina Mortada, the vice chairwoman of the Medreg Renewable Group, and she kindly accepted to moderate, to introduce and moderate the whole session. I may be back to you to say hello to you, arrivederci at the end. Thank you so much. Sorina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Hassan. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this event. I'm Sorina Murtada, Vice Chairwoman of the Medreg RES Working Group. I will be moderating this event today. As shown in the agenda, we will hear all the speakers first, and then we will move to one Q&A session at the end of the event. Please share your questions in the chat box along the session. Let us start with a presentation on assessing perceptions of investment risk in renewable energy, presented by Ms. Jasmina Hodzik. Jasmina is a manager at PwC Capital Projects and Economics. She deals with renewable energy finance policy and the external projections of the European Green Deal. She has 5 years of experience assisting public and corporate clients in the broader energy sector. In the Med, she has been looking into renewables, policy issues, IPP access to markets, de-risking, and creating enabling environments for renewable energy. Please, Jasmina, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning. Thank you, Sorina. Thank you for this kind of formal introduction. I think many of you know me by now. I've become a frequent presence at these webinars, and I'm very grateful for that to Roberto and to the team. So my name is Jasmina Hodzik. I will tell you about the study that we did together. So this was a work of PwC and the RES for Africa Foundation. And the study, we titled it Assessing Investment Risk in Renewable Energy, where we surveyed 7 countries in the southern and eastern Mediterranean. Next slide, please. Good. So I will structure my presentation in 2 parts. First, I will tell you about the methodology and why we did the study, and then I will tell you the results in 4 charts. Before I go further, I do want to give a word of credit to the foundation, especially to Ilaria and her team. So this was very much a joint effort where PwC contributed a big methodological part and analytical, whereas the RES for Africa Foundation contributed an immense network of stakeholders and contacts, and many of you who are present here in the webinar. So many thanks. I am the one speaking, but there is a collective effort behind this. Next slide, please. Good. So what is the purpose of this survey? And we often try to capture it in one sentence, which is listening to the voice of investors. And what we mean by that is that there is a lot of academic work that has been done about investment risk in the Med. But where we see a gap is that apart from that academic work, what is often missing is just the voice of investors and also the subjective perceptions. And where we are coming from is the understanding that perceptions, whether they are based on fact or not, they are real. And perceptions are impacting investment decisions, and they are an important thing to be measured in the Med and elsewhere. And so that was our first motivation, to understand what investors think. And that's how we started in 2016. 5 years later, we actually extended the survey to 3 more countries. I have a mistake in my slide where I say in 2021, we extended the analysis to Libya. Actually, we extended it to Libya, Algeria, and Lebanon, so 3 more countries. And then the second difference compared to the survey 5 years ago is that we also wanted to hear from the public sector stakeholders. So we wanted to measure, okay, this is what investors think, but what do the public sector and the policymakers, how do they see it? So that is the big innovation. And then another reason why we wanted to do this survey is to see what has changed in the past 5 years. So 5 years is a long time in countries or in a region that is rapidly changing. So we wanted to see or take stock what is improving and what needs more work. And lastly, this survey, what it serves for, and this is, I think, for Roberto and for the foundation, this is key. And it's that it gives us a basis or analytical basis of saying this is where more action is needed. Sometimes that action is just a dialogue, a business to government dialogue. So perception risks are perception gaps So the difference in what investors think versus what policymakers think, that gives us an important basis on which we will base the future work of the policy making at the time. Next slide, please. Good. Now, speaking about the survey in a bit more detail, who were the participants? We've covered 7 countries. We've had 142 persons who participated in the survey. And those persons contributed 199 responses, which is really a lot. And if probably some of you are in the audience, and we thank you very much. It means that one person could rate more than one country. And then who are these people? Well, 63% were from the private sector, 37% from the public. Within the private sector, you see it here disaggregated on the right-hand side. You see that we have a big share of professional services, and this is a mixed category, so it can be consulting, academia, engineering, etc. Then we have industry, 25%. So within industry, we include both developers and technology providers. And then finally, 7% of respondents were from finance, so banks, multilaterals, and so on. Next slide, please. And then how we did the survey. So this nearly 200 responses, what they did is we've had 26 risks, which we grouped in 5 areas. And these 5 areas were meant to represent broadly the entire project cycle. So we tried to capture the risks from the inception of a project until the actual implementation. So you see that we group them. I'm not going to go through all of them because 26 is a lot, but we start from the legal and regulatory framework. So that is the kind of upstream risk before the project is on the ground. Then we looked at the risk related to the revenues of our renewables asset, so anything to do with the returns. Then we looked at construction and operation risks. So meaning both risks related to the physical construction, oftentimes logistics and security risks, and then operational, where under this category, we also covered risk related to labor availability. Fourth category is financial structuring. So this is a broad category of financial risks, including just a very simple risk of is finance available or not. And lastly, environmental and social risks. So this category obviously became more important compared to 5 years ago, and we got some quite interesting results on that aspect as well. And then on the methodology, participants were simply asked to rate how they perceive each risk on a scale from 1 to 4, where 1 is low and 4 is high. And then they were also given a box to explain their views. So this is a methodology that we developed in 2016. We found that it worked very well. We tweaked it a little bit because in the meantime, in the past 5 years, both we at PwC and the foundation, we've developed, let's say, new skills also ourselves. We work on the Renew Africa initiative. We talked to even more investors who told us that maybe some risks need to be defined better. So it is, while the methodology is very similar, we did reflect the new learnings that we acquired over the past 5 years. Next slide, please. Good, and now I have my 4 charts in which I want to tell you what are the findings. I will not go into each country because with 7 countries it would be a lot, but just some broad regional trends which I think illustrate the main messages. Next slide, please. Good. Here I have a slide on the overall risk level, where the chart is showing the 7 countries, so from Morocco to Lebanon, where the top is the lowest risk and the bottom is the highest risk. And of course, this is the scale is from low, medium to high, so it's a kind of an abstract. There is no quantitative measurement of it. It's just purely how people perceive it. And then it's worth saying that people were not explicitly asked to compare countries. So there was no question saying, is Morocco riskier than Lebanon? But still, this kind of analysis shows an interesting trend, and that is that the region is quite diverse. So it's hard to speak of Med as one region because you see that there's 3 categories of countries broadly, where Morocco clearly shows the lowest risk level. And I will tell you more about it later on. Morocco also shows that fastest improvement compared to 5 years ago. So clearly Morocco stands out as the pioneer in terms of creating enabling investment environments. And then we have a medium category where you see Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia that are kind of medium risk. And in these countries, if you would go into the detail and disaggregate, you would see that these countries have made large improvements in some areas of risk, and then there is still some problems in some risk areas. So it's kind of, you know, a world in flux. And then the last category, you see Algeria, Libya, and Lebanon. These are countries with high risk, where quite a bit of work remains to be done. So bottom line is, Med is a diverse region. Countries are showing very different levels of risk. Next slide, please. Good. Here a slide on the historical trends. So I said before that in 2016 we analyzed 4 countries, and so we only did do the historical comparison for those 4. Obviously, the new 3 are not in the chart. But what you see in the chart, the kind of green or dark blue is 5 years ago in 2016, and the gray bar is this year. So you see that every single country improved, so the risk level decreased, which is already a great sign. There is also important variation. So you see that Morocco, the risk perception in Morocco, the change is the largest. So Morocco made a very large progress in the last 5 years, and that is kind of a testament to the public sector, who has been making large endeavors, also working with organizations like Rise for Africa, for example, and many others, to improve the overall investment environment. Egypt as well has made a very large progress. I think this is more about the baseline, because back in 2016, Egypt was in a much more difficult macroeconomic situation. So now there's been a much more stable environment. Tunisia and Jordan, smaller improvements, but still the trend is clear. These countries, the Med is becoming a friendlier place for renewables investment. Next slide, please. Okay, this is my 3rd chart, second to last, where I want to tell you about risk perception gaps. For me personally, the perception gap is probably the most interesting finding of this study. So when I say gaps, I mean the difference between what the private sector sees and what the public sector sees. So in this chart, you see that what it shows is the risk perception gap by the public and by the private sector stakeholder. And what you see is that the top 4 countries, Morocco, Egypt, Jordan, and Tunisia, there is quite a large gap between those 2 dots, so between what the public sees and what the private sees. So as a rule, the public is always a bit more optimistic, so they tend to see less risks, which is not so surprising. Generally, investors are more cautious. Probably the public is also a bit more confident about the work they are doing. So it's not surprising that a gap exists. But what it does show to us is that the countries that are doing a lot of policy work in improving their investment environment, maybe more dialogue between the public and private sector is needed, right? It clearly shows that there are some areas where maybe there are areas where more work is needed and the public sector is not seeing it that way. So that is also explaining maybe why organizations like Rise for Africa have a clear mandate and a clear mission on organizing that kind of B2G dialogue. And then the bottom 3 countries, Algeria, Libya, and Lebanon, the perception gap is much smaller. Next slide, please. Yes, this one. Thank you. This is my last slide on conclusions before I go into recommendations. And here, this is another variation on that risk perception gap. So what the chart shows is the top 10 risks in the overall region perceived by the private sector and by the public. So the private sector is on your left-hand side. And there is quite a few messages in this chart. It's a little bit busy, but what it shows is, first of all, the bar on the left is taller than the bar on the right. So clearly, the private sector sees more risk overall. which is what we saw also before. But what is interesting is where are the gaps? And you see that grid access is the #1 concern of the private sector. And when grid access, this includes both rules concerning accessing the grid, so legal like third-party access and so on. But it also includes infrastructure concerns, so the ability of the grid to integrate renewables. So that is the priority #1 for private investors, whereas for the public, grids are only priority #7. So you see it way kind of in the middle of that bar. So you see that the public is maybe not prioritizing grids sufficiently compared to what investors would need. And then the second and the third concern of the private sector is, I would call them a broad category of financial risk. So in this case, there is inflation, there is financing availability, there is exchange rate. So it's interesting for us to see that 60% of investors still think that financing availability is an acute problem. And for the public sector, that is only at the 10th priority list. And so that stands in contrast to maybe, many people would say, well, there is enough finance, but there is not enough projects. That is a claim that needs to be investigated more closely. And then another thing, so if you look at what the public thinks is important, IPP market access, yes, absolutely, that is important. Private sector agrees. But what is interesting to say is that within IPP market access, there is a distinction where it's true that in some countries there is just not an adequate legal framework. But in many other countries, the problem is not in the legal framework, but in the implementation. So maybe the laws in place are very good, but there is implementing problems. So either in secondary legislation or in setting up a regulatory body or maintaining the independence of the regulator to actually implement those measures. So in that sense, IPP market access, yes, it's very important, but perhaps the public is not having the full picture of what the private sector would need. Next slide, please. Okay, so here I have a not so interesting slide which contains recommendations. So I'm gonna speak and then you can read this later on. it's not maybe it's a bit too much text, but I group our recommendations into these 3 categories, and the first is a category of grid access. Now, obviously, any recommendation for the entire region is a little bit difficult to make because, as we saw, it's a very diverse region. So these recommendations are very overarching, and obviously in the study itself you can find the country by country view. But the grid access, clearly there is a need for closer B2G dialogue, and the grid access question needs to be understood both in terms of grid codes and governance, as well as grid investments and planning. So there's these 2 concerns, one is infrastructural and one is regulatory, and both of them seem to be acutely felt. And especially they seem to be kind of a new problem. So back in 2016, not so many investors were talking about grids. And now, probably also as a result of a growing share of renewables, grids is becoming a top priority. And in that light, I'm just gonna do a little advertisement for Rest for Africa Foundation. They're launching the Grids for Africa program, which is also addressing, and it's clearly confirming what we saw in the survey. Then IPP market access, the recommendation here is that clearly some countries need to work more closely to opening up the market to IPPs, and then other countries need to work more closely on implementation. And that implementation problem, maybe it needs a bit more attention, because perhaps the public sector does not fully perceive the implementation problems the way that the private sector would like to. Second category of risk, it's anything related to finance. So this is a very broad issue, obviously, financing availability and then how to mitigate inflation risk or exchange rate or transferability. Now, obviously, what is needed is greater cooperation between the public sector and development finance institutions. And that kind of cooperation could yield 2 things. It could yield first, availability of finance, but also, and perhaps more importantly, it could yield bankable PPAs, so standardizing project documents these things do a lot to crowd in this kind of finance. So it's kind of a high impact measure that can be done. And then lastly, political risk. I did not focus too much in my presentation on political risk because also in some sense, you know, everybody talks about political risk. In some ways, maybe it's overstated. The region is very diverse, and political risk in some countries is virtually absent, and then in other countries is endemic. So the classic example is Libya. Now, what can you do to de-risk, to reduce political risk? Obviously, there's all sorts of financial guarantees and instruments to reduce it, but in countries like Libya, what simply needs to be done is a change in the fundamental environment in the country. So in cases like Libya, political risk guarantees can only do that much. So yes, that is definitely an area of work. Next slide, please. Yes, here, just before I close, we are doing another study on kind of very similar to this one. It's again an investment risk perception survey, not on the Med, but on Sub Saharan Africa. So these are the countries, and it's ongoing. We are keeping the survey open for 2 more weeks. So far we received over 100 responses. If you would like to contribute your views to this survey, do it, and this is the link. It would be much appreciated to have your views. And that would be it. Thank you very much. I'm available for questions later on.
Okay, thank you, Jasmina, for this interesting presentation showing the results of the survey. As you have mentioned, that one of the main risks is financial. So financing plays a key role in unlocking the renewable potential of the region. So let us see with Ms. Ariane Brunel, what are the financing instruments for renewable investments? Ms. Brunel is a regional head within the Energy Eurasia Middle East African team, which is part of the EBRD Sustainable Infrastructure Group. She's mainly covering the bank's operation in this sector in Morocco, Tunisia, and Lebanon. She joined the EBRD in 2011 and has been working in the banking industry in London for the past 15 years, mostly focusing on emerging markets. So please, Ariane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just waiting for the presentation to be perfect. Okay, you can.
Yes, Ariane, we can hear you and we can see the presentation.
Perfect. All right, so you can go to the next slide. So as mentioned in the previous survey, by Yasmina, clearly the financing is one of the key element to unlock the potential of renewable energy in the region. So I think we all agree, next slide please, we all agree that the region has an untapped and outstanding potential in terms of renewable energy. I couldn't find figures for exactly the countries that we're covering, so I'm going to put figures for Maghreb, Northern Africa. But overall, I think we can draw a conclusion from these few countries, and this would definitely be the case for all the countries that we are trying to cover today. So renewable energy consumption in Northern Africa remains largely untapped relative to its potential. The countries are clearly aware of their potential, so they have all set up very ambitious renewable energy targets. So for instance, by 2030, Algeria is targeting 22 gigawatt, Morocco 10, Libya 4.6, Tunisia 2.8 gigawatt, while Egypt by 2035 targets 54 gigawatts. So these are just very, huge numbers, but clearly shows how the countries are now aware of their potential, and therefore are kind of aiming for sky is the limit now. So, however, we can see that the development is not quick enough because the power demand is growing faster than the capacity. And so, de facto, share of the renewable electricity declined from 2018 to 2018. So, there is this big potential. And as you can see, I mean, you can, when you look at the charts, you can see right now what is the breakdown in terms of renewable energy capacity. So it remains mostly hydropower, and now you have wind taking as well a big chunk of it, wind and solar. But clearly we see that this can clearly be much more than that. Next slide, please. So you have the potential, the natural resources, and then you have the technology costs that have been declining since over the past decade. So for instance, the solar panel have decreased by 85%, the wind turbines by almost 50%, and the batteries by 85%. So this is just to show that the environment, it's like the alignment of the stars. You have the resources and you have the cost declining, and so all this together, next slide please, leads you to a lot of success stories in the region. So over the past 5 years, we've just seen prices going down every time reaching a new record tariff. So the association of the combination of the exceptional natural resources, the declining technological cost, and the combined with supportive regulatory framework have led to an incredible race to the lowest tariff. So this confirms, of course, the competitiveness of renewable energy in the region, and as well the key role that these countries, which are renewable energy rich, will play in the worldwide green energy transition. Next slide. So this was just to share with you. I mean, we try to track, for instance, the tariff for the solar PV, and it starts, I think, in 2013, and just like you can see that on the left side, we've started at 17 US cents per kilowatts, and now recently we were around 1. So it just like when you look at this chart, it just reflects the fact that here we have all the conditions that are met in order to ensure that renewables are playing a key role. But then we need financing. So next slide, please. So the financing will play clearly a key role to unlock the renewable potential of the region. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to quickly, I guess most of you know EBRD, but I just wanted to quickly show how, first of all, EBRD is doing as well, is providing part of the financing towards renewable. So just quickly, but we are, I'm part of the energy group, and here we are currently focusing. You can see just very, very quickly, but you can see on the right end, the portfolio sector allocation. So renewable is now becoming a big chunk, and a big chunk of the investment of the bank nowadays. Next slide, please. And just to show again, so in the last 10 years, annual power and energy investments exceeded €1 billion, and renewable energy generation projects account for at least half of those funds. So there has been a shift, although we are covering anything from electricity sector, so from generation to distribution, there has been a shift, and clearly we are trying to participate and contribute to the financing of the renewable energy sector. Next slide, please. So this is just to show you, because there is a clear correlation between the financing and then the realization of the project. And so here is the various projects that we have financed in terms of renewables. So in terms of cumulative renewable capacity, we're talking about almost 11 gigawatts. In 2020 only, we financed more than 1 gigawatt of renewable projects. And to date, this amount represents 6.5 billion euro. Next slide, please. Another thing I wanted to mention too was the fact that we are not just financing investment, and you can see here the EBRD and IFIs, I would say, have the possibility, have various tools, at hand. And we are as well involved upstream on what we call the policy dialogue. Here, we try to promote sustainable energy with authorities, local authority, and trying to share experience as much as possible and best practices. So we are going to be involved, for instance, in negotiating a template PPA in order to make sure that it's a bankable PPA template. We can provide some comments or review and feedback on draft laws on specific matters that are relating to renewable energy. I mean, just to make it clear, it's not just renewable energy, but I'm just focusing here on the renewable energy, but this can be broader. And then you have the technical cooperation. So you have maybe more specific technical assistance, which are aiming at, for instance, we're going to mobilize some amount of money in order to fund the drafting of the Greek code, for instance, which was one of the points mentioned by Yasmina in our precedent presentation, in terms of how important it is to set up a transparent regulatory framework for investors, for instance. So this is the type of things where, from the grid capacity, from grid code, from ENS studies, PPA drafting, everything, these are going to be very specific add-on technical cooperation in order to address a specific issue or gap identified. And then there is the financing, but I just wanted to put it to show it in the bigger picture. So we are not just focusing on the financing. There is a lot of work being done upstream. Next slide, please. So then maybe if I can go back to a general discussion on what are the key risks preventing more investments into renewable energy projects in the region. And so I didn't do a big survey, or I didn't call, get a lot of responses from a lot of people, but it's just based on our experience, what we see from and what are the key hurdles preventing more investments into renewable energy projects are, and I'm glad that we are kind of aligned with what has been said from a really purely financing perspective. Clearly, the regulatory risk, it's a big one. Another issue we see is the market/off-taker risk, which depending on the country and depending on what segment we are talking about, but this is a big issue. As usually you will have, big IPP where the off-take contract is with the state-owned utility company who has some, who is not very strong financially speaking, if I can put it like this. The foreign exchange risk is as well an issue. So you will have some countries which who will decide to go with 100% indexation to hard currency, but not all of them. And even if it's 100% indexed to hard currency, you still have a foreign exchange risk, as we cannot predict necessarily how the FX exchange will evolve into the next. These are long-term PPAs. You cannot really foresee the projection for the next 20 years. And then you have interest rates risk. So this, I would say, this stands for everything for all projects. But it's true that right now Euribor and LIBOR, it's a bit kind of particular situation. But I would say clearly when you even more, let's put it that way, when we are financing in local currency, this can be an increased heightened risk. Let's put it that way. Of course, this. I'm not trying to be comprehensive, and that goes on top of all various risks, and most of them have been mentioned in the previous presentation. But it was just to maybe focus on the financial aspect. If I were to focus on the key risks, these are the ones I would put forward. Next slide, please. And then who are the key stakeholders to unlock this potential? And again, I'm going to focus on the financing perspective and the investment perspective. So here, I'm not going to talk about the authorities to set up the right regulatory framework or the state-owned utility company. I'm really focusing on who is going to put the money. So either the financiers, the lenders, or the investors. So first of all, you have the IFIs. I'm one of them. They clearly have a key role to support the renewable energy development, especially in this region. But it shouldn't be limited to the renewable energy development first. It's really important that we are focusing on the rest of the infrastructure. So for instance, strengthening the grid infrastructure and supporting the incumbent state-owned utility companies. So there is a lot of work to be done, which would not be seen as directly supporting renewable energy development, but actually this work is quite key in order to ensure that you have a sustainable development of renewable energy projects in this region. So I just wanted to emphasize this point to keep it in the big picture. Then you have another stakeholder is climate funds, international organizations like the EU, for instance. Here we see that they have a key role to play to foster innovation towards new technology, for instance. This can clearly help ensuring economic viability of the first projects until we reach economy of scales. And these funds and organizations can as well help in funding the gaps, financing gaps, if there is any. Then you have your private sector, and here I'm talking more about like commercial banks. So it's really important. Again, I'm putting a lot of responsibility on the shoulders of the IFIs, but I think in this region is key as well. To be honest, looking at the country and clearly, and this was a conclusion of the survey as well, it's not one model. You can see that you have a lot of diversified profiles, and clearly each country has its own specific features. So I think that's a given. And even on the commercial bank participation, clearly the Moroccan market is almost quite unique compared to the rest of the region. So I'm not trying to generalize too much because we need to, of course, allow for this granularity. But overall, I still believe that we can promote more and accompany the participation of the commercial banks, be them local commercial banks or international commercial banks. And this will as well have a huge leverage. So we will really increase the amount available for the region. And then you have the developers, which are, the ones who are taking the higher risk in, among the four stakeholders. And so for them to be sure that they are keen in investing and developing projects, renewable energy projects in the region, it's really important to really tackle. Here I've mentioned, set up sound and transparent business environment, but here I think I would go even further than that and relate to what has been said in the previous survey. So from the developer perspective, the grid access is key. All the other risks that were mentioned as well and were identified are key. And so in order for them to get them, deploy this capital in these countries versus others, it's really important to ensure that the key risks have been addressed. I think that you can go to the next slide, please. So thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to your questions at the end.
Thank you, Ariane, for this interesting presentation about EBRD's work and how they can assist in accelerating renewable energy financing. Please, if you have any questions for Yasmina and Ariane, put them in the question box or in the chat box, and we will collect them later on in the Q&A session. Now let us move to Mr. Stefan Gitonga. He will talk to us also on the financing part, on how to accelerate renewable energy financing and investment in the MENA. Mr. Gitonga has held several posts in energy, climate change, and environment in his career. He's currently working as a regional sustainable energy advisor in the Nature, Climate, and Energy Cluster at the UNDP Regional Hub in Amman. In his role, he oversees work on sustainable energy, climate change, and environment across the Arab region. In addition, he is the global focal point for UNDP work related to energy in fragile and crisis context. So please, Stefan, the floor is yours. Can we share his presentation, please? Fabio? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Selena. Good morning, everybody. I'll be presenting some of the work that UNDP has been doing over the years in the MENA region in relation to unlocking investment and financing for renewable energies. First slide, please. Yeah, our administrator currently is serving as the co-chair of the high-level dialogue on energy, and which will happen in September. And one of the major things he has been pushing for is investment and financing to drive access to sustainable energy for all. So I just wanted to mention that, so just to underline the importance of this to UNDP as an organization. Next slide, please. Yeah, there are certain things that are happening currently in the region. Of course, it's not just in our region, but in this region, but in other regions, which are sort of making governments and stakeholders rethink renewable energy financing. And I just wanted to highlight a few of them. There is a big inequality and rising youth unemployment, which is causing a lot of uneasiness in the region currently. There is also, and this came out because of the impacts of COVID. People have realized there is a very high gender inequality, digital inequality in the region, which needs to be looked at, especially from the sustainable energy point of view. And then the link to that is the fact that energy subsidies have a major impact in terms of dealing with whether it's renewable energies, the fiscal health of countries, and also issues to do with inequalities. So this is something else that it's a tipping point which governments are taking recognition of currently. And then there's of course the bigger picture, the planetary crisis, which is a big issue in this region, especially because it's a very dry region. It's very sensitive to climate change impacts. And then we have some elements of most of the countries in the region are becoming quite fragile and conflict affected. And then finally, the last tipping point is the fact that in the last few years, the oil prices have been very volatile and has affected a lot of revenues for governments. Next slide, please. There is, as other speakers have mentioned before me, the region has not seen a lot of movement in terms of renewable energy. But in terms of, if you look at the last 10 years, up to from 2008 to 2018, there has been quite, an impressive movement towards renewable energy investment and financing. And the most interesting part is that the renewable energy targets for most of the governments is extremely very ambitious. That is good aspect in the sense that politically the governments are supportive of this movement. And this is just to give a positive picture of the region that we are moving towards the right direction. Overall, just without just mentioning the North African region, if you look at the whole region, renewable energy percentage is quite low. It's not more than 6%, which is quite small. Next slide, please. And now I just wanted to sort of give a quick overview of the typologies of what UNDP has been focusing on We can put it in 3 words, what UNDP has been doing to encourage investments and financing of renewables is to build the institutional capacity of countries in the region. And one of the major aspects, which has been touched upon by previous speakers, is ensuring that governments have long-term policies that the private sector can rely on. You don't want a policy that's just 5 years. You want something that is, you can project 20 years or more. So that's one thing that UNDP has been supporting governments on. So the other one is looking at the public-private sector financing, building that capacity so that the governments have the institutional capacity within the country so that they are able to deal with long-term agreements or PPAs, including currently, actually, we are working in Libya to the UN system is working in Libya to support attribute that capacity in Libya, because it's very difficult to enter private sector to enter in Libya with the current situation of energy management, regulatory environment. The other thing we have been working very much to do is to support renewable energy technology deployment on the ground. This is something we have been doing for many years in the region, and the lessons that we learn from that, we bring it back to the policy development side. And recently, UNDP has started something we are calling innovations in every work that we do, including developing accelerator labs for helping countries to start looking at development in a different way, not just the traditional way. And this has been quite impressive in terms of looking at how energy is deployed, also in the upstream level and at the downstream level. Next slide, please. Yeah, we can summarize what UNDP is doing by saying that what we have been working on is actually building the ecosystem for energy transition. Looking at all the governments, they are willing to move towards a clean energy trajectory, but they're building that ecosystem where the private sector, the public sector can meet and move things has been the main focus of UNDP. So we have been sharing best practices in terms of energy transition from different countries. Also looking at the role of fossil fuels, how it can also play the revenues from fossil fuels, and the issue of energy subsidies can also come back to support renewable energies. The issue of policies, one of the major areas that the League of Arab States have committed to is developing national renewable energy action plans, which we have been supporting in certain countries. The other things is encouraging policies that will attract new innovative financing, for example, green bonds and others, the new financing instruments. And then innovation in terms of linking sustainable energy with the SDGs. The reason why that is very important is because then we can be able to tap resources, financial resources and investment from other sectors, not just the renewable energy sector. For example, currently a lot of money is moving towards supporting the health sector, mostly because of the COVID, but that one also is linked to making sure that hospitals have renewable energy in them. And the last part, one of the things that we have been working on to build the ecosystem is looking at accelerating the new renewable energy deployment in the certain major sectors like transport, heating and cooling, and industry, as these are major consumers of electricity and energy in the region. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this slide is just showing some of, when you look at that ecosystem, what some of the things that we have been doing. I don't want to dwell very much on it, but it sort of gives an idea of all these things, how they are interacting. The institutional capacity, financing, policies, technology deployment, integrating energy in the sustainable development goals, and how the public and private sector come into play. So just emphasizing the aspect of building the right renewable energy ecosystem. Next slide, please. Now, I just wanted to give a few slides on what UNDP has been focusing on in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. Yeah, one of the major things we have been working on since 2015 is to ensure that renewable energy investment and finance on the side of governments are aligned very seamlessly with the national climate change plans. And recently we have been working on the national climate contributions that governments committed to at COP21. And we have been working with several countries. I just gave an example of some of what's happening in some of the work we have been doing. For example, in Lebanon, they just submitted 2 months ago the renewed NDC, which actually increased the mitigation abatement from what they had before. And here I want to mention something that was mentioned by earlier speakers. If you look at the renewable energy target in the MENA region, it's very, very ambitious and very high. But when you look at the national climate plans that they have put for COP21, it is actually quite small. And we understand the reason why that happens is because governments don't want to commit something and eventually they don't deliver. So what we have been doing is, as UNDP, is to help countries try to raise that ambition, because when financing commitments come, the COP21 commitments are quite crucial then, because the investors, both public and private, they look at what the government have decided to do, and they see very little commitment from the NDC side, while when you look at the renewable energy targets, it's very high. So that is the issue that we have been trying to sort of help fill the gap. Next slide, please. And here I just wanted to, I don't need to go through this. I just wanted to mention some of the things we are doing to enhance those NDC commitments and align them with the renewable energy target that governments have put. These are we start by making sure that there is political will and the governments are committing themselves to that, aligning and updating the targets, also making sure the sectors, the bigger sectors that, like buildings, transport and others are incorporated, looking at the cost of investment and, advising governments on opportunities, and then monitoring progress. Next slide, please. Yeah, the second thing we do is, which I will not spend a lot of time on it because other speakers will talk about it more, is the de-risking work, that renewable energy investment work that we have been doing. And here we have done quite a lot in Tunisia and Lebanon, in Egypt too, and mostly we focus on policy de-risking. Next slide, please. Just a summary of some of the conceptual way we have been supporting countries. For us, mostly UNDP, we focus on policy de-risking instruments, but we also contribute in some ways in terms of upstream support, helping government develop dedicated, for example, institutions, emphasizing the importance of loan guarantees. And currently, and also currently, we are looking at the aspects of guarantees also in the crisis context. For example, we have noticed over the years that the private sector is willing to work in crisis countries, but they, like the previous speaker mentioned, there are all those risks that were mentioned there. And one of the innovations that is emerging in the last 2 years is to give guarantees or political, guarantees either from private or government guarantees or insurances, so that those risks are minimized. So that kind of work we have been working with government to help them to find ways of incorporating those in their policies and regulatory frameworks. Next slide, please. This is just to sort of explain further what I meant by the risks that we try to reduce. We have been trying to reduce the risk or transfer the risk or compensate for the risk. Basically, the last one, compensating of the risks, that's not our sort of what you'd like countries to do more, but what we'd like to see countries do more is reducing the risk rather than the last two of transferring the risk or compensating for it. Next slide, please. The third thing that we have been doing is to sort of scale up renewable energy financing and investments. And here we try to help countries access some of the resources like the one that were mentioned before, for example, the climate investment funds from the GCF and others, which are coming from what you can call the global public. So that they can be able to access them. The other ones is also, of course, from the private sector. And we have been working very much looking at the long-term policy development so that can happen. It's a big sort of bread and butter kind of activity that UNDP does, trying to set the right long-term public policies that can attract the private sector in investments in renewable energies for low carbon economy. Next slide, please. What we believe in is when we are helping to build the institutional capacity for governments to deal with policies and regulatory frameworks, we have seen that countries that have dedicated institutions are able to sort of bring together to attract more stakeholders in investments, both for renewables and also for energy efficiency, because even where you have renewables, you need energy efficiency. And we have seen, for example, I was very impressed to see the list of countries with less risks that were put there by my previous speaker. You could see Egypt, Morocco, and the others are in the front there. And most of that is happening because of they have these things in place. They have sort of dedicated institutions who deal with this. They have long-term roadmaps for energy. And that's why things are changing. And we do support the Arab Future Energy Index, which sort of looks at all the countries and sort of rank them to see which countries are doing all these. We have about 22 indicators that we use. And Morocco, Egypt, Jordan came also in the front. So I was very much impressed to see the same sort of characteristic that PwC found. Next slide, please. Just to give a quick, just to show the dedicated institutions. I don't need to go through this because these are institutions that are already existing in these countries. Our role there is just to support governments to build that capacity. Those who don't have them, to build them. We are involved in most of these in building through government support, working with the Ministry for Energy. Next slide, please. Just to mention some of the hubs, some of the things we have done. I just wanted to mention that recently we have also worked just for dedicated institutions with Morocco to establish the Climate Change Center of Excellence. And its main aim is investment into renewable energy. And here I just wanted to focus the fact that most of the MENA region countries, there's very clear linkages between agriculture, water, and renewable energy, and energy in general. And we have been working very closely with governments to ensure that these three sectors are interlinked and the investments are going into that. Apart from the MENA region, we are also doing the same in places like Sudan and others. Next slide, please. The fourth thing that we do very much is in different countries, apart from dedicated institutions, is to encourage and have these long-term policies for renewable energy growth centers. I think the best growth center that we know is Egypt has recently, in the last 3 years, have been doing very well with the Berber Center. We also know that the Jordan has also benefited from the fact that they have sort of put together a cluster for investment for wind and solar energy. And we have been working to help assist governments in making those some of these long-term policies for that. Next slide, please. Yeah, there are other things that are happening in our region, which I wanted to highlight, which will definitely fuel renewable energy finance and investment from both private and public sector. And one of them is the fact that national petroleum companies in the MENA region and beyond are sort of committing to investments in renewable energy. We have this in Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Syria, in our region. In the region we are talking about, we have also growing interest for public-private partnerships and corporate sourcing in terms of technologies, renewable energy technologies, and the best examples are in Egypt and Morocco. And the new emerging approaches for financing. For example, the Morocco Masen Fast Green Board to help finance the country's development of solar power. So these are just examples of some of the things we may see in future fueling financing and investments in the renewable energy sector in the Mediterranean region. Next slide, please. The other thing that is extremely crucial here, and I think will shape in the next 5 years, will shape the kind of where governments will be putting their money, is what was mentioned when Roberto was opening the workshop, is the fact that governments are currently looking at how they will deal with the impacts of COVID, of the pandemic, and the economic recovery. Most of these are looking at green recovery as one way of dealing with the pandemic, the ways of creating jobs through green recovery. And renewable energy will become a very big chapter on that. Then in September, as I mentioned when I was opening my presentation, we have this very UN high-level energy dialogue, which will be in September in New York. And within that, they have 5 topics which are looking at, and one of the topics is actually on financing and investment, on renewables, clean energy trajectory. And we expect that that will set the mood. It will set the trajectory on where finances possibly will be moving in the next 5 or so years. And then in the region, we have got the Arab Sustainable Energy Strategy, which was just became very active in the last 2 years. And in it, we have something called PACE, the the PACE program, which looks at the renewables sector itself. And we expect that will also help in moving the momentum even further. And then we have this aspect of transitioning from fossil fuels to clean technologies. It is a big movement in the region because the region is big and they are starting from a very low baseline. It doesn't look like a lot, but if you look at the recent statistics, there is quite a lot of investment that is moving towards that in the region. And then there's the fact that the renewable energy and clean energy investments are creating quite a lot of jobs, and that will become very important in the recovery, in the transition from COVID to the recovery of the region. So these are what we see from UNDP as things that will possibly very quickly shape the direction where we will start to see renewable energy financing and investments. Next slide, please. Yeah, I just wanted to finish by thanking the organizers for inviting UNDP in this. Of course, I was not able to go into the real details of what UNDP does because we are a big organization and we do quite a lot in the area of finance and investment, creating the right policies, the environment for investments. But at least I was able to highlight some of the things that we are doing, and I will be happy to elaborate during the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan, for your presentation about UNDP work in the region. Indeed, creating the right ecosystem would accelerate renewable energy financing. You've mentioned scaling up renewable investments being a main milestone to achieve renewable ambitious targets. This subject will be tackled now by Ms. Constanza Strinati in her presentation. Constanza is an Associate Program Officer at the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, in Abu Dhabi. As part of the Knowledge, Policy and Finance Center, she's responsible for monitoring and analyzing global renewable energy investment dynamics. So at IRENA, she also leads the analysis of renewable energy pledges included in the NDCs, modeling their impact on global renewable installed capacity and estimating the investment needed for their implementation. Please, Constanza, the floor is yours. We can see your presentation now.
Thank you so much, Sorina, for the introduction. I hope you can hear me well. It's a pleasure to take part in such an important discussion. As you mentioned, I will be presenting some of IRENA's activities and tools aimed at promoting renewable energy deployment and investments in particular. If we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so to set the scene, in recent years, global annual investments in renewables have been fluctuating around 300 billion, with investments primarily targeting solar PV and onshore wind, and being concentrated in a few countries in East Asia, Europe, and North America. These investments level are not nearly enough to put the world on a climate-safe pathway. IRENA estimates that annual renewable energy investments need to triple by 2050 compared to what is currently invested. But beyond renewables, an accelerated energy transition will also require a massive scale-up of investments in energy efficiency measures, supporting infrastructure, and increased electrification of end uses. To mobilize such investments, risks and barriers that are slowing down private investments need to be addressed, especially in developing and emerging markets. Next slide, please. So my presentation will highlight some of IRENA's work and initiatives that aim at reducing risks for investors and mobilizing investments at scale. Broadly speaking, our work consists of three main groups of activities: collecting intelligence. We collect a large number of data on various aspects of renewables from a variety of sources. Knowledge products. So we also produce analysis and reports on relevant topics for the renewable energy sector, such as renewable energy policies and finance. And these can be either done globally or tailored to specific country or regional contexts. On these topics, as well as on data collection, we also often provide capacity building and training activities to countries. And we finally engage with a variety of stakeholders through various platforms, including regional forums, the IRENA Coalition for Action, and the Climate Investment Platform. Next slide, please. So we will now look at each group of activities separately. First of all, I will be presenting you some of our activities related to collecting intelligence. If we can go to the next slide, please. So IRENA Renewable Data Center collects and disseminates detailed and accurate renewable energy data and statistics, which is essential for making informed decisions, including decisions related to investments. Since 2015, our data collection has expanded to cover a wide range of topics, such as statistics, policies and measures, targets and NDCs, investments and costs, just to mention a few of them. And this data is global in scope, but detailed information is also available at the country level on our website. IRENA also provides, as I mentioned before, capacity building for accurate data collection to countries, including through in-person and virtual trainings, as well as through manuals. And right now we are currently providing technical assistance to around 21 countries across the various regions of the world. Next slide, please. Through our work, we also found that countries often lack access to data and expertise to map renewable energy resources. This is key information for policy and project development, as well as for investment decisions. IRENA therefore collects information on renewable energy resources in the form of maps and time series, currently covering solar, wind, geothermal, and bioenergy. The information is standardized and made available to project developers and governments through a freely accessible web-based platform called the Global Atlas for Renewable Energy. Based on this information, IRENA also provides direct support to countries, first through suitability assessment and zoning analysis, which identify suitable areas for solar and wind development. At the moment, for example, we are conducting this exercise in the Arab League states, including Mauritania, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan. We also have site appraisal activities where we basically support countries in screening specific solar and wind project sites to identify the most promising ones. This work is done upon country request, and so far we have identified more than 60 solar and wind sites in Africa and SIDS with a prospective capacity of around 2 gigawatt. Third, we support the municipal planning of smart cities through a software that's called Solar City Engine, which analyzes solar resources at the very granular level for rooftop PV in cities. And finally, we are also collaborating with the World Bank and the International Geothermal Association to test a new standard for reporting estimates of geothermal resources in Indonesia, Ethiopia, and the Caribbean island, with the goal of reducing investors' risk perception and facilitate access to private capital when it comes to geothermal. Next slide, please. So I'll just move now onto the our knowledge products and capacity building activities. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this was mentioned by the other speakers, but in order to attract investments, a sound policy environment is needed. For this reason, IRENA analyzes policy instruments supporting the development of renewable energy at the global, regional, and local levels, with a focus on the design of these policy instruments. This work encompasses the analysis of renewable energy targets, including in nationally determined contributions, auctions, which have become increasingly popular, but also policies and measures for renewables in end uses such as heating and cooling and transport, integrating and enabling policies such as power market redesign and industrial policies, policies for green hydrogen, and policies for off-grid renewables and energy access. At the global level, we identify common criteria and indicators that policymakers can use to decide what what policy instruments to select. Usually the criteria are effectiveness, efficiency, equity, institutional feasibility, and replicability. But we also tailor our work to the regional and country context, for example, through our regional market analysis. Recently, we have analyzed in details the policy landscape of countries in the Eastern Mediterranean and Middle East regions, and provided a policy toolkit for decarbonizing energy system from which each country can pick different instruments based on their national conditions and priorities. Our team also studies trends in the financing of renewable energy assets in order to identify gaps, give recommendations to policymakers and investors on how to scale up capital, private capital, especially in the sector. Under this work, we analyze global investment trends, but also the effectiveness of various financing instruments to finance renewable energy, such as risk mitigation instruments and green bonds. And we also look at specific capital pools, such as institutional investors, to assess their potential role in financing renewable energy. Based on our analytical work on policy and finance, IRENA provides tailored advice and capacity building to countries with a goal of helping them to set up the necessary enabling conditions to attract finance for renewables. Over the years, we held several capacity building workshops and roundtables with investors across the world. And recently, we are conducting a detailed study on the policy and finance landscape of North Macedonia. And we are organizing online training activities right now for Albania and Sudan. Next slide, please. So based on countries' requests, IRENA provides a comprehensive package of support through the Renewable Readiness Assessments, or RRAs. These are comprehensive assessments of key conditions for renewable energy deployment in a country. The RRA relies on a consultative multi-stakeholder process where IRENA serves as a facilitator to translate political commitment into renewable energy investments. The objective is to identify policy, regulatory, and institutional challenges to the deployment of renewables, and highlight technology pathways and key actions to overcome these challenges and maximize the socioeconomic benefits in a specific country. So far, IRENA has developed more than 40 RRAs worldwide, including in Egypt in 2018, in Lebanon in 2020, and in Jordan this year. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, IRENA also analyzes the interlinkages between the energy system and the broader economy to assess the socioeconomic impacts, positive and negative, of the energy transition. For example, we find that globally, the energy transition is projected to create 13.3 million more energy sector jobs by 2050 compared to what would be achieved with current policies. And globally, the GDP in 2050 will also be 2.4% higher than in a business as usual scenario. However, the socioeconomic impacts of the transition will vary between countries and regions due to the diversity of structural conditions in each context, such as, for example, the level of fossil fuel dependency, different supply chains, and different level of national ambition and means of implementation. This is critical information for policymakers to adjust policies and measures in a way that they can maximize the positive impacts of the energy transition and attract investments. Next slide, please. So looking closely at MENA, the MENA region, for example, IRENA's analysis shows that energy sector jobs will reach 7.3 million in 2050. With a net additional job level of 0.7 million compared to the business as usual scenario. When it comes to employment in the renewable energy sector, the graph on the right in this slide, jobs can reach 2.1 million by 2050. And bioenergy would be the dominant employer in the region, followed by solar and wind. If we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so IRENA not only projects future job potential, but also examines existing employment levels, providing updated jobs data for all renewable energy technologies, examining key factors influencing job creation, and highlighting selected country cases. For example, Egypt's solar PV sector is currently estimated to employ around 3,000 people, with an additional 1,200 jobs in other technologies, including wind, small hydro, and CSP, and solar heating and cooling. Job creation ranks high as a concern for policymakers. Understanding the employment impacts, therefore, is essential not only to policymakers, but also to investors. And this includes understanding how many jobs are being created, in what parts of the world, and in which segments of the value chain. Next slide, please. So building on this, through our work on leveraging local capacity, we provide a clear understanding of the materials and labor requirements along the supply chains of each specific technology, renewable energy technology. So far, we've looked at solar PV and onshore and offshore wind. This knowledge can be applied to assess local capabilities, build dedicated institutions, and design appropriate policies and programs. But it also helps to attract investments beyond the installation step of the value chain by identifying those activities that are worth investing in based on the localization of the value creation at each stage of the value chain. In the Mediterranean region specifically, IRENA has analyzed in detail the factors driving the development of the wind industry in Morocco. Next slide, please. Finally, I'll just want to briefly walk you through two of our stakeholder engagement platforms. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the first one is the IRENA Coalition for Action, and this is a multi-stakeholder network convening over 115 leading players from the renewable energy sector, including industry associations, private sector companies, civil society and research institutes and organizations such as Rest for Africa. Its mission is to convene a global dialogue among non-governmental and governmental stakeholders to develop actions in order to increase the share of renewables in the global energy mix. As such, coalition members engage on key renewable energy topics through working groups, public-private dialogues, and various strategic and programmatic activities. Currently, we have the coalition has 4 working groups focused on business and investors, community energy, decarbonizing end-use sectors, and toward 100% renewable energy. Next slide, please. So the business as an investors group in particular has been focusing on the urgent need for scaling up investment in high potential emerging and mature markets. The group has produced a number of joint knowledge products on and country-specific policy recommendations based on the experience they have on the ground and best practices. Country-specific policy recommendations are then disseminated through position papers that are used as a basis for the public-private dialogues with policymakers. So far, the working group has developed position papers for Algeria, Colombia, Jordan, Tunisia, Vietnam, and Mexico. These are all available on the coalition website. Next slide, please. So finally, IRENA also provides tailored technical assistance and financing matchmaking for renewable energy projects. In 2019, IRENA, together with the UNDP, SC4All, and in collaboration with the Green Climate Fund, set up the Climate Investment Platform, or CIP. And through the CIP, IRENA teams up with governments, financial institutions, project developers, and the private sector to develop solid project pipeline backed by the governments, assisting in bridging project proposals to reach bankability and facilitating their access to finance. Next slide, please. So this is the geographical reach of the 218 projects that are registered currently on the CIP. These projects were taken forward through a tailored quality entry assessment done by IRENA in order to assess their investment readiness. This process, broadly speaking, covers aspects such as technology, financial viability, sustainability, environmental and social impacts of projects, but also the alignment with countries' goals and objectives, especially with the NDCs. It also covers requirements of international financial institutions to be considered for financing. From early next year, the implementation of the CIP will be further supported through the organization of investment forums that will be organized in 14 geographic clusters, including 2 sub-regions of the MENA region. And we hope that these will offer an effective forum for enhanced government-investor dialogue, dedicated project matchmaking, and also associated capacity building activities. Next slide. Yeah, so looking forward to the Q&A session. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Constanza, for presenting IRENA's work. It was mentioned several times during these presentations today that the presence of an independent energy regulator is a key factor for investing and promoting renewable energy. So let us see what Mr. Pedro Verdelo has to say about empowering Mediterranean regulators for a common energy future. Pedro was appointed in February 2019 to the board of directors of the Portuguese Energy Regulatory Authority, ERSE, for a 6-year mandate. Prior to this appointment, he served as the director of ERSE's pricing and tariffs division. He's deeply involved in the European regulatory cooperation. He is also involved in MEDREG as the chair of renewables working group after serving 4 years as a chair and co-chair of MEDREG's gas working group. Pedro, the floor is yours. Fabio, we don't see Pedro's presentation.
Thank you, Sorina. Are you hearing me well?
Yeah, we hear you very well, and we can see the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody. It is with great pleasure that I joined this RES for Africa MEDREG workshop on assessing investment risk in renewable energy. And I want to point out that this event is particularly important in the current situation we are living with this COVID pandemic. We have indeed to keep doing our activities safely, using these fantastic IT tools that are available to everybody, And thus, congratulations for the organizers to enable this very important debate in this virtual context. Thank you very much for giving me indeed the opportunity to share with you this presentation, where I will call your attention to the moment of a major change and transition we are currently facing that requires our utmost attention and action. The energy transition that we are living is characterized by integration of renewables at large scale into our energy system, and particularly in the electricity system, taking into account that electrical-based technologies are being the preferable solutions to control and recover renewable energy sources. In some of our national electricity systems, for instance, as is the case of Portugal, my country, renewable generation accounts today for more than 50% of the generation mix. And this policy objective is now indeed an unavoidable megatrend due to the technological developments observed in renewable generation, where the level cost of renewable energy sources technologies became cheaper than the level cost of conventional technologies burning fossil fuels. Economically, it is now very rational to invest in these new technologies because they are cheaper today. There was a technological shock, just as the one we observed some years ago on the telecommunications between the mobile networks and the fixed network. So these new cheaper technologies based on renewables are emerging to satisfy the same needs and with a service with added value for consumers and for the environment, allowing decarbonization with reasonable prices guarantee for all our consumers. Today, renewables are a competitive process enabling decarbonization and economics. These two dimensions, decarbonization and economics, are aligned. And in fact, if they were not, we wouldn't speak about a transition process. When we are talking about transition, we have to involve people. So people is deeply involved in terms of behavior in this transition process. And if these two concepts, two dimensions, decarbonization and economics, wouldn't be aligned, we would hardly accept this transition, and consequently it would not be a fair one. So I want to highlight that our decarbonization goals and also affordability now, due to the technology developments that we observed in renewables, ensure a just an acceptable transition for all the actors, namely for the consumers. And as chair of the MEDREG RES working group, I would like, so I'm here in that position, and I have to call also to thank Sorina. So we work together, sharing the MEDREG RES working group, also with Shafika, our colleague from the National Regulatory Authority of Algeria. And I would like to call your attention to two of our deliverables during the last 2 years, the period of 2019 and 2020, on this topic about renewable energy generation. So the first deliverable is analysis of auction mechanisms to promote RES, and the second one, new available regulatory options for the integration of RES. The first report seeks to analyze the renewable energy auction mechanisms applied in the Mediterranean basin and on an international level. A SWOT analysis regarding res auction mechanisms, and a set of recommendations are presented in this first report. In the second report, we analyze regulatory options for the integration of small-scale decentralized RES, enabling the so-called democratization of the access to the generation activity. I have to highlight that these outstanding reports are available on the MEDREG webpage, so they are public available, and they address, besides other aspects, the topic of our workshop today on assessing investment risk in renewable energy. So in this slide of my presentation, I present the two topics that I will address. The first one on energy sector challenge toward decarbonization, and then I will finish with a practical case in my country, Portugal, regarding the solar PV auctions that were realized in the last 2 years. In the next slide, well, here we see a picture, and what I want to share with you in this slide is that the energy transition that now is in the mouth of everybody, I think we are preparing it for a few years. It didn't start today, neither it will not start tomorrow. It has started a long time ago. Indeed, I think we, depending on each national situation, we are observing the introduction of huge amounts of renewables in our electrical system. For instance, as I have already said to you, last year in Portugal, we achieved, I think, 60% of the generation, 6% of the energy generated on electricity was based from renewables, wind, solar, and water. And to enable that, it's, I think, a very high percentage. To enable that, I want to recall the history of our energy markets. We, at EU level, we started with the 3 energy package, establishing some essential rules and roles for the functioning of our energy market. This is particularly important, as was already mentioned by the other speakers. We had to have a robust policy framework, a robust regulatory framework in place. And to do that, we have to establish essential rules and roles for the functioning of the market, the energy market, including liberalization, unbundling, in case of EU, building an internal energy market, so creating regional markets, regional hubs, spot markets where power or commodity, for instance, gas, are traded there. And of course, to enhance this regional perspective, we have to create new entities, new regional entities. And at the EU level, we created the agency, ACER, and the ENSOs. We developed network codes, regional network codes, binding network codes, and strengthening the consumer rights. This is fundamental. This pillar, as already I said, it is a very important one to have this stable regulatory framework with codes, with rules that show to everybody, namely to all the actors, namely the investors in the energy sector, what are the rules that they will be binding to. Well, at the EU level, this internal energy market, electricity and gas, in all the time horizons, they are key. They are instrumental to enable the integration of renewables at large scale and at least cost. It is important to acknowledge that we have made collectively an excellent work during these last years. Moving to the next slide, I show a picture to highlight that we have to keep pushing for the efficiency of this regional, in our case, the internal energy market, and do not give it as granted. Markets are indeed a fantastic provider of the needed flexibility to couple with renewables in all the different time frames, from the long term to the day ahead, intraday and real time. The integration of renewables at large scale call for the need to have more flexibility, and so balancing markets should be as open as technically possible to all participants, facilitating access to emerging technologies and players such as RES. For this purpose, explicit technical barriers to RES participation in short-term markets, like for instance, high transaction costs, disproportionate qualification rules, or disproportionate IT requirements, they should be removed. Also, the need for finer time granularity, balancing products in balancing markets might be needed. A special attention, and I think this is a very important dimension, beyond the spot markets, a special attention to the integration of the balancing markets from national ones to regional ones is also key in order to enhance its liquidity and competition behavior, taking into account that their relevance increases with the level of RES penetration. All cross-border infrastructures are also key, so our interconnectors among each national market, they are also these huge IPs, these huge infrastructures are key to enable RES penetration at least cost. This dimension of investments in large infrastructures and organization also of markets through appropriated methodologies. So I'm talking about hardware tools to connect our markets that will enable the creation of regional markets, and also software tools related to the tools that are used on these markets. This tool type of process on hardware and software allow optimization of the system in its various temporal dimensions, avoiding massive investment needs in generation assets and allowing the reception of large amounts of renewable energy with the well-known uncertainty, so the temperamental characteristics of nature, of the environment, at the least cost in an affordable way. This dimension of market integration is fundamental, and we have been working on it for over 15 years, representing in fact the great instrument for decarbonization. I think we have done and we are doing an excellent work in this dimension of market integration. Then in the next slide, we see a second dimension that was in the middle of the first slide I presented, regarding to the implementation of the clean energy package at EU level, which here is where we stand now, and we are preparing the way for a new market design and a new energy system that facilitated centralization, consumer participation, and more energy efficiency. Nowadays, we have already some national electricity systems that centralized physical layer. Physically, we are already, I think, in some cases, in a centralized transition, with renewable generation connected along the distribution networks in lower voltage levels. But this centralized physical layer still coexists with a centralized commercial layer. And this is something very important to address. And here in this slide, I try to show that with a more centralized and friendly commercial layer with transactive energy, peer-to-peer contracts, fitted to small-scale distributed energy resources, it will be possible, in one hand, to democratize the access to the generation activity, and in the other hand, to unlock the short and medium-term flexibility available in our end-user process, in the industry, at our homes and service and buildings. Unlocking our embedded local flexibility will ensure the integration in our energy system of higher levels of renewables at least cost. And in the next slide, I think that with this slide, I'm trying to share with you what we are discussing now at the EU level regarding the hydrogen strategy and the foreseen decarbonization package to update the past gas directive. And well, to respond to the environmental, social, and political challenge, I think we need to go beyond the innovations in the clean energy package and look from an integrated energy system perspective. This is the direction the European Green Deal has set, and we as regulators are committed to contributing to achieve a carbon neutral society. The enhancement of this third dimension related to cross-sector integration. So the first dimension was the energy system integration in a horizontal way in order to enable the implementation of regional markets. The second dimension is the clean energy package, the local issue, trying to unlock the flexibility in the houses of the consumers at lowest cost. And then we have the third dimension, which is cross-sector integration or energy system integration between energy carriers as shown in this picture, and also sectors of activity, for instance, mobility. And well, this third dimension might also enable to solve the problem of the needs of flexibility of medium and long term imposed by the cold and hot seasons, the dry and humid seasons, and those with greater and lesser solar radiation, summer and winter. For this medium and long-term flexibility, we need storage systems with enormous energy density. And also this dimension will enable our society to move for sure to net zero, decarbonizing the intensive CO2 sectors and managing long-term flexibility at least costs. So this is the, if we want indeed to go to net zero, we have to address the decarbonization of the intensive CO2 sectors, and also the long-term flexibility. We have to address these two issues, and in order to address these two issues, we at the EU level, we are discussing energy system integration as the missing link missing policy link to achieve that. Well, in the moments that I have referred, so where we need to be able to store renewable energy when it is in surplus through high density energy vectors, to be able to be used it in other periods. And this massive storage, I think this is important, this massive storage between seasons and between years cannot be dependent on low energy density solutions whose volume of stored energy is directly proportional to the amount of rare metals or materials needed, elements that are scarce in nature, as it is the case of battery technology. We have to find other ways to store energy decoupled from the use of these elements and infrastructures for the storage of natural gas, which can be used by other molecules, namely decarbonized gas, guarantee this decoupling. We will not be able to free ourselves from fossil fuels without networks and storage of renewable gases that guarantee flexibility and resilience in the medium and long term. A special reference should also be made to pumped water storage that has high energy density, but whose growth dimension is limited due to geographic and environmental reasons. And now I will go to the second part of my presentation. So in the next slide, I will present the results of the recent solar res auctions organized in Portugal. If we can move please to the next slide. And also the next one. So here I see a figure where we can see the amount of solar PV auction that was installed since 2010 to 2019 and the policy objectives foreseen to 2030. To achieve these policy objectives, so we are talking about 6.9 gigawatt of adding capacity solar PV solar to the system. We realized two auctions, one in 2019 of 1.4 gigawatts of capacity, and one in 2010-20 of 700 megawatts of capacity. And high competition in those auctions resulted in a world record of price in 2019 of 14.8 euros per megawatt hour, and also again in 2020 a record price was achieved of 11.4 euros per megawatt hour. And in the next slide, I share with you that these auctions, the auctions realized in 2020, if we can please move to next slide, integrate three different schemes from the producer side that compete among each other through an algorithm that computes for each of the three schemes the net present value in euros per megawatt. So we have an auction mechanism, but the promoter or the producer choose the scheme he wants. And the first scheme or first option is the conventional and known fixed tariff, feed-in tariff, so a guaranteed remuneration that represents a remuneration scheme in which the promoter undertakes to install the awarded solar power and receives an annual fixed amount in euros per megawatt. The producer is obliged to sell the energy in the market, and the referred to fixed amount is guaranteed through a contract for differences between the power price and the fixed tariff. If the power prices are higher than the fixed tariff, the producer pays the difference to the system, and in the opposite situation, the system pays the difference to the producer. The second option, call it general remuneration without storage or merchant option, represents a remuneration scheme in which the promoter wins the network capacity right to inject the adjudicated power, selling the energy in the wholesale and balancing markets, and thus being remunerated by the observed market power prices. Additionally, he assumes the obligation to pay to the system the amount resulting from the auction on an annual basis per megawatt. This payment will be included in the access tariffs, contributing to its reduction over time. The third option, called the general remuneration with storage, represents a remuneration scheme where the producer undertakes to install the adjudicated power of solar panels and also a storage system. This storage system must have minimum requirements in terms of power and energy volume. It must have a minimum power of 20% of the network connection capacity and a minimum storage energy or volume corresponding to the energy of 1 hour to the nominal power of storage system converter. Several technologies solutions are possible, namely electromechanical batteries, thermal energy storage like concentrated solar, or electrolyzers like power to gas and fuel cell with intermediate hydrogen storage. So here we are talking indeed about dispatchable renewable generation. So it's technology that indeed can be controlled because we have an internal storage facility. So all these options are handled in the same auction using the formulas in the bottom of this slide, where the net present value is computed for each of the schemes in euros per megawatt. Moving to the next slide, I also propose to move to the other one, please. So I'm going to show you the results of the auctions, and here we may see, so these are the 2020 auctions. So a total of 700 megawatts were auctioned. We realized 12 slots for different positions in the different geographies in the Portuguese territory, and the amount of the capacity auction is presented on the second column. On the third column, you may see the number of competitors. So it was a huge number. The initial volume that was presented, so the starting of the auction process, so a huge ratio was observed with the values higher than 10, and then we have the number of rounds also. And moving to the next slide, here we have the final prices, and we may see in the right side of this figure, in the tables in orange, we may see that what were the prices, the final prices. The fixed tariff was in the column in the middle. Here we reach in slot 7, we reach a price of 11.14 euros per megawatt hour, being, as I mentioned, the world record. And then we have the merchant option without any storage on the left column in orange. Here we see that, well, so here producers are selling the energy in the spot price and also on the balancing markets. And besides that, they have to pay to the system for the access. They have to pay, they are paying this price with a minus. So they are paying to the system prices between 32 euros per megawatt hour and 40 euros per megawatt hour. And on the right side of the column, we have the case of renewables, PV, solar, with batteries or with storage also in the technology. And here the prices result also on a payment to the system that varies between 8 euros and 30 euros per megawatt hour. We may also see in the bottom of this slide that all of the 3 remuneration schemes were allocated, being the one that most deserved the interest of the promoters, the third one, merchant with storage. It's interesting, followed by the merchant with no storage. So selling in those both schemes, producer is selling the energy in the market, taking the risk for the power price, and is paying to the system those values in negative. And it's interesting to see that the mechanism that deserved less interest was the fixed tariff regime, where we obtain a price, a feed-in tariff of 11 euros per megawatt hour. Moving to, here I show several, in this slide I show several PV auction results around the world, and the world record for a huge project that was already mentioned was observed recently in Saudi Arabia with a price of 9.45 euros per megawatt hour. And well, to conclude, I would like to repeat that what was said by previous speakers regarding the importance of having a stable, predictable, and transparent energy policy with independent national regulatory authorities that balance all the interests. These regulatory authorities, independent, I have to say, when we speak about independency, we speak about independency from the government and also from the private sector that ensure consumer protection and contribute to the general public interest. There is indeed a positive correlation between the existence of this regulatory framework based on independent national regulatory authorities and resilient and affordable energy systems. And with that, I conclude. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hand over the floor to Sorina.
Thank you, Pedro, for this interesting presentation. We are running ahead of the schedule, behind the schedule. So we are going to take some questions from the audience. The first one is for Ariane. Ariane, at what stage does the EBRD fund energy-related projects?
Thank you very much for the question. So I would say we can come quite early on with a little caveat, but we have been supporting, for instance, projects where we will be financing some ENS studies or feasibility studies, so that can happen. Most of the cases, I would say that we would be doing this type of things more with the public projects, but clearly something we can explore for private, but maybe less current, less common. And as mentioned as well, so usually we would come once the project is ready to be financed, but we can have this involvement before in order to finance some of the studies.
Thank you. We have a question from Mina. I don't know, I think it's also for Ariane. It's related to the public stakeholders. Any recommendation for public stakeholders regarding the declining of technology cost?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a good question. Clearly, there is, again, there is so many things to be said, and each country has its own context. I think there is a lot of work, and I've mentioned it in my presentation, to be done with and alongside the state-owned utility companies. The declining of costs is actually very helpful in demonstrating that renewable is a credible alternative. I see it in two stages. You have countries where renewable energy is not that developed. I would say, I don't know, countries like Tunisia, Lebanon, in which case here I think it's a very good demonstration of the fact that renewable energy are competitive, and that's actually quite beneficial for the state-owned utility company to diversify and to ensure that to reduce, its energy bill and increase the share of renewable. So I think that's the good thing is since we've seen the nice and the amazing tariff that really helped in our discussions with this state-owned utility company. And then you have other countries where clearly renewable energy is quite developed, but we are still not there. I mean, we are not clearly at 100%. So what is this missing piece? How can we go further? How can we be more ambitious? And maybe here I'm talking about countries like Egypt and Morocco, let's say, to illustrate. And here there is again some work to be done. Some work to be done with the utility company as well, to gradually think about alternatives, not in terms of increasing the renewable energy share, but actually in terms of phasing out, for instance, coal. So, kind of thinking about the decarbonization strategy, the long-term, low carbon pathways, and this strategy. And this is clearly something we can work alongside this state-owned utility company in order to ensure that overall, not just from a renewable energy perspective, but the whole sector is actually, as carbon neutral as possible. So clearly a key stakeholder. I don't think we can just say we should focus on the private sector. And I think here it's clearly the role that the IFI should be playing, working as well, focusing as well on the state-owned utility company. And on top of it, there is a lot of work to be done in terms of, introducing digitalization work with them, introducing a better financial operation mode in order to just for them to increase their and strengthen their financial operations. Because at the end of the day, most of the time, if not the only, one of the key renewable energy off-takers. So you need to make sure that they are viable over the long term, because you are taking their risk at the end.
Very well, thank you, Ariane. We have a question from Jonathan. How can I reach out to Irina? I believe, yes, Rest for Africa can do the link. They can send you by email Constanza's email address or any other way to connect. We have two questions for Pedro from Abdul Malik. Pedro, they are asking if they can have the documentation for this solar auction in Portugal. And the question is, how can a regulatory authority be independent when it's funded by the government? Is this currently operational in any country? A very good question, actually, Pedro.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So regarding the first one, I suggest that you send an email to the MEDREG Secretariat, and they will resend it to me, and I will be happy to provide you with all the information. Regarding the second issue, it's a very important one indeed. How to ensure independent from the national regulatory authority from the government. And we in MEDREG, we have a document where we express that. So what are the measures that will ensure that? I can share with you some of them. For instance, the board members of the regulator, they should have a mandate that for a fixed term, for instance, of 6 years, and it's a position that cannot be withdrawn from, they cannot be dismissed from the government. And in the process of choosing the board members of the National Regulatory Authority, all the institutions that are that we have in our society, namely the dependent on country by country, namely the government, the parliament, the president, or the king, all these three institutions have to be involved in the process of choosing the board members. One may present the name, another may appreciate that person, and the third one may appoint the person. So depending on the process you choose, you guarantee the independence of the board members, and then we have to also, by law, to define a framework that NRA, the National Authority, has to comply with. For instance, to take any decision, we, the National Authority, should involve everybody by a public consultation with procedures that are foreseen in the law. These procedures have to be established in the law. We are also obliged to have committees in our National Authority to where all the actors, stakeholders, are participating in the decision process, having their representatives from the suppliers, from the regulated industry, the infrastructures, network monopoly, and from consumers associations, households associations, and industrial consumers. So all these and those councils, for instance, approve our budget. They present an opinion of our budget. So through the transparency, you can ensure the independence of the regulatory authority from all those parties: government, industry, and of course, trying to protect consumers and enhance the public interest. So we have a paper in MADREG where we highlight those important aspects. Thank you for putting the question.
Thank you, Pedro. We have two more questions related to the survey, and they will be the last questions. How to explain a low-risk perception for public actors, and did the survey take into consideration the institutional stakeholders and their risk? I believe Yasmina has left the webinar. I don't know if Roberto or anyone from Rest for Africa can answer these questions.
I think Ilaria should, or Rima, because they are the two writers. The co-writer are Ilaria and Rima. I think they should answer, because I'm not sure my answer. Ilaria,
Thank
Rima,
you, Roberto. Ilaria.
Yes, Sorina, can you repeat the question?
How to explain a low-risk perception for the public actors? And the second question, did the survey take into consideration the institutional stakeholders and their risks?
Yes, for the second question, the answer is yes. Regarding the public sector, our perception is that they are also involved directly in the renewable energy transition. So we are sure that the perception of the risk is also low because they are doing their best to foster the renewable energy transition. But there is also our perception that we are working on the correct direction regarding this renewable energy transition. Also comparing the result with the survey of 2016. So we are sure that they are working on it, and we are trying to find also the way to promote the transition with the local stakeholder and with the public and the private investors.
If I may add, my perception is that, of course, the public side sees less risk. First of all, honestly, it's a little bit defensive. You know, they have to defend a little bit the consistency between the targets announced and the effective things happening. So every time we found such a a discrepancy between private sector. Now, the second reason, so the first one is, of course, they want to defend what they are doing, even though they don't want to be criticized also inside. But also the most important issue is because private sector, the one at least representing us, they want to do things at scale and fast. And that's what some public stakeholder doesn't really get it, because this may imply deregulation, may imply unbundling, may imply excessive delegation to private sector. It's also a cultural problem. I think we have to convince the public sector that the risk is perceived in terms of choices. Many of these companies, the one of my member, invest in 27 countries. Now, if they go to Algeria, just name one country, or they want to go to Brazil or Mexico, you go to Algeria and they say, oh, you cannot have more than 49% of shareholder, 51 must be Algeria. So this is something already which is a barrier, you know. And then you go to Algeria again, because I was there and I really look forward. And they said, what about doing solar power plants? The module must be Algerian, cannot be otherwise. Say, well, what about your watch? What about your iPhone? Is Algerian? No. So it's a kind of a conservative approach. And then finally, the third objection of the ministry said, and all the money must be coming from a local bank. Now, the size of the effort, it requires international financing. So I'm trying to explain to you why there is a discrepancy, even more should be, between private sector wishing to come and invest and the public sector defending or protecting an unprotectable frame. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto. Unfortunately, we have to leave. We have to close our webinar. I would like to thank all the speakers on behalf of RES for Africa and Madrag. I would like to thank also all the participants. And RES for Africa is ready to answer all the questions related to the survey. Please feel free to contact them regarding any comment or recommendation. Thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you soon. The last comment, are we sharing the presentations, Ilaria?
Yes, thank you, Sorina. Thank you very much also to Hassan for the co-organization of this event. And thank you for all the speakers that has contributed the success of this event. As Sorina also anticipated, we are ready to answer to all of questions. We have collected all of the questions. Unfortunately, we haven't time to answer all the questions right now, so we are available for any further discussion directly to you and to your network.
Also, let me add that the result, the paper you received, I think you can appreciate. It is the best guess on the perception by a variety of private sector. It's not the ultimate answer, but I hope they provoke some discussion. That's why having together Madrag and RES for Africa, the private sector and the regulator, really provide you the size or the defining the key factor of where to go. Now, I hope that this survey, jointly presented also with Madrag, can also use in other events during the year, maybe G20, maybe the Med Dialogue in December. There are many, many occasions where we can bring the outcomes, maybe in a more concise way, and provoke some reaction from particularly the public sector. But thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be with my friend regulator. I don't see my friend Veronica. Where is Veronica today? Veronica Lenzi. She was my stagiaire.
Roberto, unfortunately, she couldn't make it.
You know, Veronica was my stagiaire in Paris at the Home. She was a younger girl coming there. She was still blushing there. So I'm really seeing she's doing a career. She's also doing a career with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And don't forget passion. No pay, passion. Okay? Arrivederci.
Thank
you
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.